Good evening. My name's Richard Cockett. I'm the Africa editor of the Economist magazine. And tonight we're going to discuss South Africa. And the obvious peg for that is the recent landslide re-election of the ANC. And Jacob Zuma, the leader of the ANC, is inaugurated as South Africa's new president on Saturday. So to discuss that and the future of South Africa, the future of the ANC government and maybe its consequences for the whole continent of Africa, we've got a very distinguished panel, which I'm now going to introduce. On my right, but not necessarily politically, is James Eedes, formerly Africa editor of the Banker magazine, the specialist banking and capital markets publication, Financial Times. He's recently, he tells me, gone over to the dark side, left journalism, and he now works in corporate finance. So we applaud him on, we applaud him for his good timing in making that move as well. Thank you. On my immediate right, Josephine Hazeley. She's the editor of Focus on Africa, which is probably many of you know is the main BBC World Service programme, sort of magazine programme about Africa, broadcast throughout Africa. Very good it is too. She has the added advantage of having been in South Africa to watch the elections several weeks ago. On my immediate left, Alec Russell. He's now the FT's World News editor. Having just taken up this job after a stint as the FT's correspondent in South Africa. He was also in South Africa before, in the mid-1990s as well, so he's got quite a good long perspective over the whole period of time since the ANC first came to power after the first full multiracial elections in 1994. He's too modest to do this, so I'll wave his book around
he's not
for
too
him.
Modest to do it.
No, he's not too modest to do it. Okay, I'm going to huckster for him.
It's really good.
This is his book. It's coming out on...
Today.
Today, okay. Maybe that's why he's here. Anyway, it's very good. It's the journalist's view of contemporary South Africa. Much acclaimed, and it should sell well. On my far left, maybe politically as well as geographically, is Andrew Feinstein. He is I guess, freelance author now, are you? Yeah, a lecturer. But more importantly, he was a member of the South African-born member of the anti-apartheid movement, and one of the first ANC MPs in the first post-apartheid parliament from 1994. He, as many of you will know, has travelled a long way since then. Has become one of the ANC government's most severe critics, and you can read all about it in his book, After the Party. This is the updated version of a book first published a couple of years ago.
Late 2007.
Late 2007. This too is excellent. So we have two South Africans, many journalists, people working on the continent. And what we don't have, but we tried to get, was someone who could speak for the ANC and give the ANC's perspective on South Africa. After all, they did win this recent election by an enormous landslide, a very impressive feat after so long in power. Just ask Gordon Brown at the next election. So what I've asked James Eedes has volunteered. In fact, I twisted his arm. But I just asked James, since he's closely connected pretty to the finances of South Africa, I've asked him to be the sort of man who could put himself in the mind of the ANC, in the mind of the new government, perhaps, to give us the sort of ANC's perspective on how they see South Africa at the moment and how they see the future of South Africa. So he'll do that. Maybe he could be an actor, so he could go in character, and then when he wants to give you his own view of things, he can.
So he's going to do Bring Me My Machine Gun.
Yeah,
he's going to.
Exactly. That's his task. Then he can switch into sort of objective banker journalist mode. So he's kindly consented to do that. I think the ANC. to be fair to them, it's a transition period here. Nobody knows who their jobs are anymore until after Saturday. So they said it was too hard to put anyone up for the event this evening. So enough of that. We hope the session's going to be generated entirely by you, the audience, questions from the audience, but just to liven things up and just, I hope, to tease out the perspectives of where our panelists are coming from on these questions. I'm just going to ask them a first question so they can make their opening pitch to you. Very simple one. Jacob Zuma has been elected. He's got a huge majority in Parliament. He becomes president officially on Saturday. How do you see the next 5, 7, 10 years for South Africa? Let's go with Andrew first.
It's a long lecture, the answer to that question, so I'm going to be very brief and maybe add some more as we go along with questions. My instinct is that what we're going to see from Jacob Zuma, first of all, I think, and I'm going to use a little bit of the title of Alec's book, I think that what is happening within the ANC at the moment is that there is a battle for the soul of Jacob Zuma taking place in the ANC, because nobody knows exactly where Jacob Zuma stands. He fought the election very much as a champion of the poor, to whom perhaps enough has not yet been delivered. I think the ANC has actually delivered quite a lot in the 15 years of democracy in South Africa, but I would say that the poorest, probably 25% of the population, have been left out of a lot of the progress that has taken place. And he has positioned himself in contrast to Thabo Mbeki, and Zuma and his supporters often refer to Mbeki as the president and his briefcase carriers, to sort of caricature them as technocrats, as against, here is a guy who grew up herding goats, very little formal education, understands the needs of the poor and will be able to deliver for them. But in policy terms, having worked with him for a number of years when he was a provincial minister for economic affairs, I think he's still something of a policy blank slate. He has said certain things about rural development. He said certain things about further widening the social grants net. But on the big issues, the big macroeconomic issues, I think he remains something of a policy blank slate, and he's been able to say to very different interest groups pretty much what they want to hear without, in essence, choosing sides. So he's had support from the business community, he's had support from the trade union movement, the South African Communist Party, and now is the time to decide. I think he is going to be a far more accessible leader in many ways, certainly initially. After the Thabo Mbeki years, he will seem more engaged with ordinary South Africans and ordinary ANC supporters. I have a very real fear, and I really am having to curtail this. So, as I said, I'll add more meat to it. But I have a very real fear that if things don't go well, either if some of his legal difficulties return, which they could, and I'll explain a bit more about that later, or if he isn't able to deliver, having said this is almost a new ANC government that you're now voting for. And if they're unable to deliver for those core supporters, that he might go back to some of his more instinctive political reactions. And there I have fears about his commitment to certain of the constitutional institutions. The independence of the judiciary would be one. That Parliament and various other organs play their constitutional role. This has all been eroded for years under Thabo Mbeki. And I just fear that Jacob Zuma could, in a sense, revert to type if things don't go well. And then I think towards the end of the 5 years, things could get a bit troubled. I also expect to see, as a final point, that there will be some sort of realignment of opposition politics in South Africa in response to yet another overwhelming majority for the ANC. But more of that later.
Alec.
I agree with a lot of what Andrew says. I mean, on his opening point, that Zuma is a bit of a blank slate and no one really knows what he stands for, I would add to that, I'm not sure if even Jacob Zuma knows what he stands for. And I haven't worked with Jacob Zuma, but I have spent quite a bit of time in his company in the last couple of years, and I met him a few times in the early 90s, but more important were these meetings in the last couple of years. And he talks an incredibly good game. And if he were sitting here and instead of Andrew there, and Richard there, sorry.
James.
Jacob, instead of Jacob there. He would tick all the boxes that most of you, I guess, or many of you would be concerned about. He would tell you that Mbeki's policy on Zimbabwe, as he told me, was disastrous, and he'll tell you some entertaining stories about Mugabe. And you'll think, oh, good, so South Africa's controversial policy towards Zimbabwe is going to be better. He will tell you about HIV/AIDS, and despite his own hugely controversial utterances in the recent past on HIV/AIDS, I think that is one area which he will undoubtedly be completely different from Thabo Mbeki, and that it is incredibly important. So while everyone's going around saying, oh my God, is he going to be a scary populist and whatever, that is a critical policy issue which he will be, I think few people have any doubt, will do the right thing. So he'd tick that box. He'll tell you all about the need to deliver more to the poor, the problems about getting the fruits of liberation to the people that fought for it and so on. And he'll talk to you about business. Yes, we need business. You'll think, oh, this all sounds terrifically good, but does it mean anything? And I suppose I would have, just to go back to Richard's question, I have three scenarios for a Zuma presidency. He says he's only going to do one term, so let's take him at face value. But as we all know, once you're in power, it gets rather attractive in whichever country you're in. The one scenario, I wish I could say I was most confident about this scenario, but I sort of, it's a combination of a Reagan scenario meets a Lula scenario. The Lula scenario being a lot of people had misgivings about Zuma coming in, particularly in business. They thought he was some sort of radical left winger who would destroy the Brazilian economy. And in fact, he's proved a reasonably pragmatic leader and so on. So there could be that element to Zuma mixed in with the Reaganite idea is just that, wow, it's been quite a time in the last 10 years under Thabo Mbeki, as Andrew chronicles very powerfully in his book. And South Africa needs a break. It needs a more relaxed leader. It needs a leader that ordinary South Africans of all races, of all backgrounds, feel comfortable with. They feel that he's someone who's going to listen to them and so on. So that's the upbeat scenario. He stays in for 5 years. He makes South Africa feel better about itself. He delegates government to technocrats. There'll be some bad people, but some good people, and South Africa heads on, and let's hope it copes with the chilly winds from the economic downturn and so on. Then there's I think the more likely scenario, which is that at best we see a continuation of the same slightly debilitating strands under Thabo Mbeki, that the party continues to lose its way for all sorts of reasons, and so on. Crony capitalism spreads, and it's not an out-and-out disaster, but it's not a great success. And then there's the idea that Andrew posited, and sadly one can't rule it out, that there's a vacuum. He just can never really take control of things. The party's feet, already the party's trying to work out who's going to succeed him. He's not powerful enough to keep the party together. He doesn't really make decisions. The country drifts. The economy's continuing to be in deep trouble, and he resorts to populism, and the world looks on and thinks, oh God, what on earth's happening here? Three scenarios.
Which one do you pick?
Well, I'm gonna
on the spot.
I'm gonna have to be optimistic and go for a blend of the first and the second, and just hope that that's right.
Okay.
And that's optimism. So you may say that that's anyway.
Okay. Josephine.
Thank you. I am going to pick this scenario where I think he's going to be a pragmatist. He's going to do what will deliver for the shack dwellers, for the domestic workers, for the miners, and for the huge number of unemployed people, particularly the youths who voted for him. Because if he doesn't, it will have the cope to cope with. Even though, COPE to have a lot of work to do, that's the opposition. He needs to deliver for these people, and he has in his first statement after being elected as president by parliament yesterday. He set out, I think, I think, 4 areas in which he says, concentrate on. On education. As you know, South Africa has a very high illiteracy rate, and he needs to do that in order to prepare the citizens for the jobs that may come after the economy picks up again. He says he will deal with health, and by God, he needs to deal with that, because apart from the fact that the health facilities are beginning to crumble, there is the unfortunate situation of South Africa having the huge AIDS problem, and that a good number of those with the HIV, AIDS, still do not have access to the antiretroviral drugs to deal with. So he really does need to cope with that, as well as the health service personnel that need to be trained to look after those who become sick. He also said that he needs to get South Africans to work, and he has to. And there are signs that it's still possible that he can achieve these things, because we know, yes, of course, the economy is in a bad way now all over the world, which is very true. But there are lots of projects that had been earmarked ages ago that have still not been implemented in terms of infrastructural development. And one of the reasons I was reading in Business Day is because there are still not the manpower or the technical know-how in some of the rural, maybe administration, the provincial administration, to administer these huge projects that will stimulate the economy. And I have to hope that he will take the stand of, even if he has to get foreigners to go and help do these jobs, so that the infrastructure could be built, so that jobs could be created. I would want to think that he needs to do that. In terms of him being in power for one term, he probably will, because by the time the election comes in 5 years' time, he will be 72 years old. So that is pretty, that is pretty old. So he probably will not. But again, he had said since that well, it's left to the ANC, serves the ANC, and you know the ANC, you would know better than me, has this business of collective responsibility or so. So it may or may not be there for another term. But also, I think internationally, I don't think South Africa the foreign policy will be any different from what operates now. I mean, because South Africa works with SADC. They're not going to go away from what SADC says. I mean, because if they were going to do that, they would have done so, you know, over Zimbabwe. But, you know, they didn't. And Zuma really did not deviate, even when he was not the head of state. He did not deviate from the policies that obtained. And also, there's the African Union. I mean, South Africa is going to go by what the African Union says. I don't think South Africa will stand up and publicly declare itself divorced or say something that is contrary to what the African Union position is on any issue. And I think at the UN, South Africa will stand by Africa, you know. They've done so on several occasions. They have not left the African camp. For example, they stood up when they were in the Security Council member, when they were there for a few months as member of the Security Council. They were ready to stand with Africa and say that the UN must try and help solve African conflicts. So I don't see a lot of change in that. I'm sure the world is looking to see who the cabinet is. I wish we were having this debate after the cabinet had been formed. Then we can all see exactly where his thinking is and where he's trying, you know, he's trying to take the country. But everybody's watching to see if Trevor Manuel will remain finance minister. After all, he is respected in the world, but some people are thinking that he may be moved to the planning commission, is it? That is one of the, I think, his big ideas, isn't it? Zuma's big ideas is to form a planning commission that hopefully would tie in all the strands of government and deliver for the people. But we'll have to see what happens when he names his cabinet, maybe next week or something.
Okay, thanks, Josephine. James, can I ask you to magically transform yourself into an ANC? You don't have to go all the way.
No, I'm not going to. I'm that sort of somewhat rare thing of a positive white South African in London. So it's easy for me to speak with some balance and a sort of positive outlook. I'm going to decline to speak on behalf of the ANC because I think that Andrew and Alec have summed it up quite well, which is to say we don't really know what they sort of stand for, certainly what Zuma stands for, and how how everything is going to sort of unfold in the next sort of weeks and months as the cabinet is formed and sort of policies are articulated. I think where we are now is a situation where you can look at the glass sort of half full or half empty. I think we forget how bad the Mbeki years were in some respects. And so I think to have broken with that is positive. I think more importantly we have ended the sort of logjam that we were in even before, but certainly post the Polokwane watershed when Mbeki essentially became a lame duck. And we've had, for the intervening period, a great deal of uncertainty and drift, which certainly hasn't stood the country in any stead. And if you think of something like the World Cup coming up, you think of pressing problems like addressing Eskom, the power crisis. We've lacked the urgency and the leadership and the sort of steer that was needed to kind of push the country along. So I think that's very important that we've ended that, even though we don't yet know exactly what the future holds. I think that no one would deny, notwithstanding all of Zuma's lack of clarity over his policy positions, I don't think anybody would deny that he is a man very comfortable in his skin. He is known for his conciliatory approach. He certainly has a very successful record in calming the warring factions in KwaZulu-Natal. Certainly he was instrumental in that. And given the extent to which, and we really only realize this in hindsight, how much Mbeki had sort of re-racialized the discourse in South Africa, I think it's very positive that Zuma has come along, and for the time being at least, he's taken a far more conciliatory line. Again, I think South Africans are very sentiment-driven, and I think whilst we were worried about the corruption allegations, the rape allegations, questions around his character, South Africans are fickle. They will forget that. If he acts in a manner befitting the office, you'll quickly sort of see people rallying around and sort of positive. If he can sort of lead the country will follow. And I think that is all walks of society. I think the third point is that he has promised better people in key roles. Again, we wait to see exactly the shape of the cabinet. But I mean, Barbara Hogan was appointed to health within the wider sort of Zuma faction within the ANC. That was positive. I mean, don't think anybody's in doubt that the former minister was a disaster, and Mbeki's policy towards HIV/AIDS was a disaster. There is language of appointing. I mean, we talked about the Planning Commission again, a more sort of firmer hand in terms of guiding and steering government policy. Obviously, we wait to see who's there, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that if you look at the many new faces going into Parliament, you look at the sort of, and you sense the renewal that's being felt in the country, and you only have to look at the voter turnout, where voters are still very much engaged with the political process. There's a lot of energy to do things well. Yes, it's easy to take a cynical view. I think there are plenty of risks, But if you go back to my first point, which is that we're coming from a period where we just really got stuck in the mud, I think that we have the potential and opportunity to sort of move things forward, positively and fairly dramatically in terms of how they seem on the ground.
Okay, thank you, James. I'm just going to ask one more brief question since we've got people very well equipped to answer it, and then I'll throw it open to the floor. One unique thing about Zuma taking power here is that he's taking power in the teeth of a very deep recession. The first time this has happened since any ANC leader has taken over since 1994, and it probably looks as though South Africa's having the largest downturn, in fact, of any African country. So since we have a range of sort of economists and financial journalists here, I just wanted you to say very briefly, how bad is it? How deep do you think recession will be? Will South Africa come out of it? And what do you think the consequences it will be for the politics of South Africa? And James, maybe we could start with you, go around the other way.
I would question whether South Africa is worst off in Africa, and that's a matter of data, and I don't have it to hand. But I think South Africa, whether by luck or by good planning, I think it's a combination of both. The country is very well poised to deal with the recession, which is globally driven. Our public finances are in excellent shape. Just some stats. I mean, public debts around 94 was close to 50%. It's now down to about 22, 23%. We've been running a fiscal surplus, which has gone into a deficit. Typical sort of Keynesian pump priming, running a deficit during the downturn. We have, in America, they like to talk about sort of shovel-ready infrastructure projects where, it's not about allocating spending, which happens 18 months' time. It's actually allocating spending on projects right here and now. You only have to look at, large parts of South Africa with 2010 World Cup coming up, very large power projects, Gautrain projects. There's a lot of activity, and you have to look at construction cranes. So I think there's no doubt that the economy is likely to contract. That's certainly the view of economists, but I think the extent of that contraction is going to be limited. And I also think that the pace of the recovery will be somewhat quicker. You're already sort of starting to see portfolio capital flows returning to South Africa. I think that investment appetite for South Africa. I mean, I think in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, we were getting lumped in with countries which are in a far worse situation, and I think there's a more balanced view that in fact South Africa is in good shape. That doesn't mean that we're not going to sort of see some slowdown, but it's the extent of the slowdown and the pace of the recovery, and I think South Africa is very well poised to respond to that.
Thank you, James. That's the bullish view. Josephine.
Thank you. I have to agree with James really entirely, because I really do believe that South Africa is not in a place as bad as other African countries, not by a long way. It's not. And I also, like him, think that there's lots of infrastructural programs that are there waiting to be done. And there is, the public finances have been dealt with really quite admirably by Trevor Manuel, the outgoing finance minister. And I am sure that those monies will be used. The public purse will have to be open so that those monies could be used to invest in areas that needs to be upgraded. We all know where they are. The townships, the deep rural areas where living conditions are appalling, and people there, as we went to see them during the elections, were crying for their roads, we're crying for water, we're crying for basic sanitary conditions. They're still there. So the investments are there. Private investment is slowing down. I think that is what is slowing down. It is private investment that is slowing down, but public investment, I don't believe, is slowing down to that extent. And anyway, South Africa is in a position to grab the opportunities once the world financial downturn begins to pick up again.
Great. Alec, what's your view?
Yes, well, there are some bright points. I mean, point number one, at a time when large sections of the sort of world's developed economies are struggling because of the catastrophic collapse of their banking system, South Africa has been spared that, and that's very interesting. South Africa has possibly the only, I think, yes, well, the only sophisticated banking system in sub-Saharan Africa, and because of the because of the kind of very draconian regulator in South Africa, the banks just weren't able to start investing in what we now all know as toxic assets. So, great banking system, pretty much unimpaired. So that's a slight cause for optimism. But I'm afraid I remain pretty gloomy about the South African economy, and I suppose, yes, if the world's economy picks up and global demand for its minerals suddenly picks up again and mineral prices soar, then South Africa will recover. But it's in a fairly bleak state at the moment. I just picked up today, sort of clicked into my inbox, the latest unemployment figures, another 200,000 formally declared unemployed in the first quarter of this year. You know, there are huge problems that South Africa faces, and the global downturn is exacerbating them. And unless there's very clear direction from the Zuma government, clearly keeping Trevor Manuel on in some major role, which will be, I should add, difficult for some of Zuma's allies who really abhor him. And so it won't be easy. And he also abhors them. They've had all sorts of rows. So it won't be a particularly happy cabinet. I think that there's a very difficult time ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, Andrew.
Just very quickly to add a few points. I think the crisis is only starting to have an impact now. There have been unemployment figures going back a couple of quarters, but today was reported that the last 3 months have seen the biggest collapse in property prices in 23 years in South Africa. And the first South African bank, because I've always had a view very similar to Alex about the stability of the banking system, the first big bank, Nedbank, today reported losses as a consequence of bad debts today. So I think the reactions are going to be fairly delayed. But I would agree with the general point that I think the macroeconomics have been handled in a very orthodox and a very stable manner that I think will probably do the economy well during this crisis. And I have to say that, you know, being in South Africa as recently as 10 days, 2 weeks ago, economically it feels far better than the UK or the US does at the moment, to be quite honest. But I think that the fundamental point is that there will be less money in the fiscus for the sort of social delivery that is so desperately required in South Africa. And if one links that to what has proven to be, not just in the health sector, but in a number of other sectors, a fairly limited capacity to implement on some of these projects, I think that's where the difficulty arises, and especially the way in which those sorts of factors feed into the political dynamic we were talking about in the previous question. So the ability of Zuma to deliver to those people to whom he has now promised a great deal. And I think it is worth bearing in mind when we think about how that will feed into the political process, is that South Africa today, very sadly, is a slightly more unequal place than it was even in 1994 at the end of apartheid. So the stable orthodox macroeconomics have had this consequence that there has been a big sector of South African society who have missed out on the economic boom and the economic progress that has been made.
But that's more to do with the management than actually the policies, isn't it, possibly?
No, actually, I think it's a combination of both.
Well, a combination, probably.
It's a combination that we can certainly discuss later.
I think the other point to add is that it's been a persistent problem. It's not through lack of funding, but rather the capacity and particularly human capital capacity to sort of deliver. And you've seen in the budget where, you know, particularly capital budgets have gone unspent. And again, that stems from very rigorous management at National Treasury to block wasteful spending. But I think this is South Africa's ability to provide better services to the poor, a clear sort of election promise is less about funding and more about capacity at provincial and local level. Now, that's a real problem. I'm not suggesting that we're going to get around that, but I think it's a little bit of a red herring to say it's all about funding.
Okay, there you go, a range of views. I'm going to take questions from the floor now. Just to reiterate what Duncan said, could you just tell us who you are before your question, and also just tell us quickly your relationship to the means of production, i.e. your job. And we're looking for questions rather than lectures too, just as a warning on timing. Okay, and we'll probably take them in 2 or 3, and then I'll get everyone to respond. Yeah, gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Jamil Zaberi. I'm a banker. One of the big problems of Africa is corruption. Will South Africa be able to arrest it, or will it slide? And what's the panel view on it? I personally, who occasionally visit South Africa since first I went in 1985, I personally find I'm hassled a lot more by the police in the recent past than it used to be in the past.
You mean for bribes?
Yes.
Okay, take another question. Maybe one right at the back.
Thank you. My name is Michael Story. I'm a businessman, and I tried to invest a lot of money in South Africa a few years ago, and I was confronted by black empowerment. I was urged by ministers to engage in black empowerment groups as a vehicle to invest in South Africa. I was then pestered by groups of black empowerment organizations to be given shares in the venture that I was seeking to establish. So the question very simply is, how can the ANC survive when, in fact, a very small elite of black people in South Africa are being made quite rich by the policies of the government, when Zuma and even Mbeki swore that they would actually help the people in South Africa who are below the poverty line and derive the services?
Okay, well, look, let's take those 2 questions right away, because both of them are excellent, and they both touch on 2 of the biggest issues, corruption and black economic empowerment. Andrew, do you want to start with corruption? Because you're the you're the local expert. So maybe.
I mean, for those of you who aren't aware, one of the big things in the book that I write about is a huge arms deal that I try to investigate as the ranking ANC member of Parliament's Public Accounts Committee in South Africa in 2000 and 2001. And that the ANC basically neutered the investigation. So there's never been any proper investigation of this in South Africa. And this was at the time that Mbeki was saying we didn't have the money to buy antiretroviral medication for the over 5 million people then who were living with HIV or AIDS. And I do think that since then corruption has become far more of a problem in South Africa, because this was the point, crucially, at which the ANC was prepared to use state contracts, in this case huge arms deals, to garner money not only for individuals but also for the party itself. I mean, that was the crux of the matter. The party, 9 months before the 1999 general election, was bankrupt. And I know that because I was involved in the financial side of the party. And then in that election, we spent literally tens of millions of dollars hiring a company called Stanley Greenberg Associates, based in New York and Washington, who had run the Clinton-Gore campaigns in America, and they didn't come cheap. And even at its last conference in Polokwane in late 2007, no written financial statements were presented, but the Treasurer General announced that the ANC had a surplus of something like 1.5 billion rand, which does make it one of the richer political parties anywhere on the planet at the moment. And I think since then it is rand, that is true. Well, interestingly, the rand has been a very strong currency over the last 12 months, one of the strongest. So
especially compared to the pound.
But crucially, I think that there was this very widespread sense in South Africa amongst ordinary South Africans who, you know, in a poll that was conducted just a few weeks back, almost 70% of South Africans still want to know the full truth about the arms deal and what happened to all our money, because we bought all these armaments, most of which we don't use now. We bought 28 jet trainers from BAE Systems and then 24 jet fighters from Saab. And the Air Force had said they really don't want these planes, they don't fit the technical specifications. They were 2.5 times more expensive than the planes that the Air Force actually wanted. And that was on top of the shortlist. The BAE Saab planes didn't even make it onto the shortlist. But 116 million pounds of bribes were paid, and that's why we went for those ones. So there was the sense that developed, well, if they can get away with it, so can we. And we've had a whole series of scandals. And there was something called Oilgate, and something called Travelgate in Parliament. And unfortunately, the ANC tended to benefit from them all. And then the development of this network of companies called Chancellor House that fed into the black economic empowerment issue, that was benefiting from a whole lot of black empowerment deals, and it had been set up exclusively to provide the ANC with financial resources. So I do think that corruption has become more of a problem. I don't think it's on the levels that you find. For instance, I do quite a bit of work in Bangladesh, and I don't think that it is yet at the sort of endemic levels that one finds in Bangladesh, but it has definitely become more and more widespread. And I think as public resources do become reduced, so issues of corruption become more important. But I think the other dimension of corruption that we have to mention is how it erodes the institutions of democracy. And this has been happening progressively in South Africa, and nothing in Jacob Zuma's record suggests that he's going to be any better. In fact, there is the possibility that he could be worse, and again, I can talk about that more. The corruption issue is related to black economic empowerment, but I don't want, maybe you want me to hold
let's
on
de-link
that for
them
the
for a second.
Fine.
Thank you very much, Andrew. What are your perceptions? Other panelists, you know South Africa well. Is corruption a problem, and more importantly, is it getting worse? And do you think Zuma's the man to tackle it? Given his own record.
That worries me. I mean, corruption is the one thing that worries me about the future of South Africa. Because, for example, talking about Zuma being the president and the person who should, you know, whether he would be able to tackle it remains a doubt, because a lot of people, when one was traveling in South Africa, thought that perhaps it may have been better if he had gone through the courts process and been found not guilty. Then everybody would know that it is the courts that acquitted him, and therefore it would become more believable that he was not involved, whether whether they found him guilty or not. But he didn't do that, and so that still leaves a question mark, even though they keep saying it's to do with it was stitched up by Mbeki. But maybe a little hope might be Ellen Ziller. You know, she's been campaigning on this anti-corruption platform, and she was able to convince the people of Western Cape that she's, and all the South Africans living in the UK, because they voted for her in overwhelmingly in the last elections. She's been able to convince them that she's the one who could serve as, how do you say, as the watchdog against corruption. And people like those, if she keeps on digging and keeps on speaking like she's been doing, that will help to create maybe an atmosphere whereby Zuma and his cabinet colleagues and those in the rest of the ANC may think twice before they get involved in corrupt practices, but I don't know. It's just a hope. And also, maybe a little glimmer of hope, maybe the Treasurer General of the ANC, I think, has spoken about this cronyism that creates corruption. And he was saying that that has to stop. So one can just hope that he means it and he was not electioneering. But the fact remains that they are aware, I think, that their record or their characters, if you like, have been tainted very, very darkly or severely by these the arms deal situation, and the fact that the inquiry that people wanted, so that we can know one way or the other whether they were involved or not, have still not been done. But yes, corruption does worry me, because I do not want to see, as you can tell, I'm not South African. I'm from Sierra Leone, West Africa. But I do not want to see the corruption in South Africa become like it has in other parts of Africa, in Nigeria, for instance, or in Kenya, for instance. It will be a sad day, I think, for me as a non-South African, if it is allowed to go that way. But I believe it won't, because the South Africans themselves, even the ordinary South Africans, are quite political, and they are seeing that corruption is a bad thing, and it doesn't give them the houses that they want or the jobs that they want. And hopefully, if some of the COPE people who are now in parliament do not form an alignment and go back to the ANC, and they become watchdogs and expose all of these things, there may be a hope. But yes, corruption does worry me, I have to say.
Okay, James, could I ask you to comment briefly on corruption? Then, Alex, do you want to
just a very brief one. I want to make a very brief point on that, and then we can talk about BE if you like.
Yeah.
But you go first.
Corruption, I think, is going to get worse. I think that it stems from sort of the impunity that comes with such overwhelming political dominance. I think Josephine's point about the DA in the Western Cape is very good. I think that they have an opportunity to demonstrate better governance, which kind of creates a counterbalancing sort of force and influence. I think why South Africa might not, hopefully won't go the way of the worst excesses of corruption, is that we do have different centres of power who, these institutions, individuals, corporates, whoever they are, eventually it becomes so bad that it starts to sort of impugn our reputation. And I think South Africa is more plugged into the world, and I think it is worried about these things, and so I think that eventually there's going to be a sort of line in the sand, and where ordinary South Africans and influential South Africans just say no more. And again, I don't think that's sort of speaking truth to power. I think that's going to be realised at the ballot box, where the ANC continues to lose power. And I think what COPE showed is they don't have to lose a lot of power to start responding to the threat.
I'll be very brief on corruption, because I think we need to get on to B.
Yeah,
but I think
B,
first, in answer to the question there, well, look, there's nothing inevitable about South Africa slithering down some path to the appalling corruption of other states. It can be stopped, and it can be reversed. It has to. But equally, I think there's a danger that a lot of South Africans, certainly certain members of the ANC, who I know sort of tend to believe, which is, but we are this exceptional country. We're this exceptional country in Africa, and we will always be different and better because of the great anti-apartheid battle, and we have this terrific independent media and independent courts and so on. Well, yes, much of that is true, but equally that is not going to be enough to stop South Africa becoming appallingly corrupt. And as Andrew points out in his book with his arms deal, there is appalling corruption there already. What is critical is the mindset of the ANC. It's all about no amount of good intentions by Helen Ziller, the media, or whatever, is going to stop this drift towards corruption. It's all got to come from the inner circle of the ANC, and it requires someone in the party to yank it around. Is Zuma that man? Let's just say for a moment, let's say that he really wants to do this, and I'm happy to take him at face value. He's about to start his presidency. Let's say he really, really wants to clean up the ANC and thereby clean up the country. Will people listen? That's the problem with a man with his record. I mean, I'll end on corruption now, but in my book I write about some young members of the ANC who regard being in the party and having connections to government as solely a way of making vast sums of money, and they see Jacob Zuma being there as a way of facilitating that. So it's a huge task. It has to come from the ANC. And one has to take a deep breath, seeing Zuma there, because with the best will in the world, I'm not sure whether lots of people are going to listen. But let's hope I'm wrong. But BE, I think, is what we should
neatly in.
Yeah.
Do you want me to talk briefly about B? I mean, again, B, a terrifically important policy. For those of you that aren't very familiar with South Africa, just in essence, it is the policy aimed at reversing the financial injustices of apartheid, as opposed to the political injustices. One man, one vote helped to rectify those, but this was, yikes, under apartheid, 90% of businesses were owned by white companies, were managed by who were managed by white South Africans, etc., etc. So we've got to reverse this. We cannot just rely on the market because it will just take far too long, and politically that's impractical. So there have to be government policies, ultimately compelling companies to sell a stake in their company to a black business entity, and so on. So far so good. I think most people would agree that something had to be done, and quicker than just relying on market forces. But as the questioner said very compellingly earlier, the trouble is the policy's gone a bit awry, and we've ended up with a number of phenomenally wealthy business people who are all incredibly closely connected to the ANC. And again, I spent a lot of time with two of the most famous of those, Cyril Ramaphosa and Tokyo Sequale, who Andrew knows well, and they are among the richest people in Africa now, and frankly not by virtue of their business expertise, but purely because they were in powerful positions in the ANC when the ANC was moving into business, ka-ching, ka-ching. And it has to be changed. The policy has to be changed. I spoke to Cyril Ramaphosa about this at length, actually, in London quite recently, and I said, surely there needs to be a sunset clause. If you're not going to put off other businesses from getting involved, and if you're really going to try and spread the wealth, you need to reform it. And he said, yes, 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 we need to reform it. And I think he means that and believes that. But a sunset clause, and he balked at that, and he said, we will know when there needs to be a sunset clause. We don't want to put a date on it. And so it's a huge problem. But final point, the upside to the story is that it's not just a story of fantastically wealthy tycoons while everyone else is living in impoverishment. There are some black economic empowerment enterprises that are working well, and there are more of those happening now than was the case 5-10 years ago. And I met all sorts of young black South African entrepreneurs who are doing fantastically well. And so it's quite easy when one's in London, I know, and anywhere looking at South Africa, you think it's just a tale of billionaires and impoverishment. And there are many people in between who are benefiting from these policies, but that's not to take away from the basic point that the policy now needs reform very, very rapidly.
Andrew, you wanted to chip in just briefly on?
I think just very briefly on that, to say that the fact that a black economic empowerment policy is needed, I think, is just a non-negotiable in South Africa. If there is not more rapid economic equalization across race groups because of South Africa's history, South Africa will not be a socio-political success. But the problem is, as Alex suggests, that it's been far too narrowly focused. It's been used as a form of political patronage, and Mbeki used it very effectively. Now, the problem within the ANC, the reality is that a lot of the people who coalesced around Jacob Zuma and who funded his political survival and then reascent are people who believed they were kept away from the trough because they had political differences with Thabo Mbeki, and this is now their opportunity. And Tokyo and Cyril, well, who just jumped ship. I mean, in the case of Tokyo in particular, Cyril managed to be successful even while he was at loggerheads with Thabo Mbeki. He was a difference. Tokyo Sequale, who I worked very closely with as his economic advisor when he was Premier of Gauteng, made the very strategic decision to get out of politics because Thabo Mbeki wanted him out of politics, in return for which he got a very prominent place at the trough. And as soon as he realized that the political weather vane had moved to Jacob, boom, he jumped on the JZ bandwagon very quickly and very effectively, and he is now probably the richest man on the continent. But the problem that I have, and I'm sorry, but this brings back the linkage again, is that someone like Jacob Zuma, to what extent is he going to be prepared to repel those demands for patronage from his very closest supporters? Because let's not forget, this is a man whose legal team introduced over 30 legal attempts to ensure that his case never came to court. This isn't a man who desperately wanted his day in court to prove his innocence. Because the Constitutional Court in South Africa, the highest court in the land, made a very telling judgment when his financial advisor, Shabir Sheikh, unsuccessfully tried to appeal a 15-year sentence for corruption, fraud, and money laundering. And they said, Mr. Sheikh did pay bribes to Mr. Zuma. The payments were made by Mr. Sheikh in order to influence Mr. Zuma to promote Mr. Sheikh's business interests. And Mr. Zuma did, as a matter of fact, promote Mr. Sheikh's interests. That was a judgment of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. The prosecutors in the Sheikh case wanted to prosecute the two of them together, but were stopped from doing so by political interference. So that's the big question, and it's going to be the big question that determines, I think, the success or failure of Jacob Zuma's time in power.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's take some questions from floor. We can come back to.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Yes, in the front here.
Hi, I'm Joe Boyd. I'm a music producer and writer. This is a question which may or may not relate to the patronage issues that you've just been discussing. Nobody so far, except very, very briefly, has mentioned the Z word, Zulu. From a distance, one sees a pattern in South African politics that at the initial election, many Zulus stayed outside the ANC. They sided with Buthelezi, the Inkatha movement. They lost. There was a kind of accommodation that Mandela made. And it seems that over time, many Zulus have joined the ANC. There was an article not too long ago in The Guardian following the riots against immigrants, pointing out that many of the leaders of the violence against immigrants were Zulus, and that there was a feeling that they had sort of surrendered their position as outsiders from the ANC, joined the ANC, and Zuma seemingly may represent a kind of takeover of the ANC by the Zulus, and that the people who started the breakaway party were all non-Zulus. To what extent does he represent this tribal development?
Thank you. Take another one. Audrey, you wanted to ask something. Thanks.
My name is Audrey Brown. I'm a journalist from South Africa, and I was there also just recently covering the elections. I want to ask two questions, if I may. One would sort of touch on what Joe Boyd just asked, but the first question I'd really like to ask is concerning corruption and the influence actually of big business in South Africa. For instance, we talk about the BAE and the fact that South Africa bought all these planes and so on from BAE, but we don't actually discuss exactly what role business plays in South African politics and how corrupting that actually is. I mean, how did it come about that South Africa bought these planes from BAE when the Air Force didn't want them? And I think, Andrew, perhaps you're in a very good position to talk about that. Also, the way in which economic empowerment, actually black economic empowerment, actually has been implemented in South Africa is as a result, I think, of various threats and blackmail from business in South Africa. That it suits big business in South Africa to have 6 black tycoons, but not a broad-based economic empowerment policy that actually infiltrates money, contracts, etc., to more people. And I'm glad, Andrew, that you made the point that it is filtering down, and Alec, you too, talking about how there's a dynamic relationship actually between the policies that the ANC has suggested and how they're implemented, and where people see the need to tweak them, as it were. Because I think the policies themselves are sound. It's how they're implemented. So I think that's the most important thing that I'd like to address. But the second thing, it's not exactly the Z word, but it's the R word in South Africa, and that's race. Because, James, you said that Thabo Mbeki re-racialized the discussion, the public discussion in South Africa. I think a lot of South Africans would feel that actually Thabo Mbeki brought race into the discussion when Nelson Mandela had negated race in the discussion in South Africa. Jacob Zuma and the ANC as it exists now, because I think that's really the point for me, is that it's the ANC now rather than just Jacob Zuma, because Jacob Zuma in a way is a cipher for the ANC. I think what comes out of the ANC, he might have a stamp, he might put a stamp on it in the way that Nelson Mandela did and Thabo Mbeki did, but their policies are fairly established, I think. I think that the ANC now, as the ANC in the past, is very adept actually at using a race card in South Africa because it's so easy. And I don't see that changing. If it's necessary, I think the ANC will use the race card. But maybe I'm just slightly pessimistic about that particular aspect.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I don't feel that race needs not to be discussed in South Africa. I think it's a very important discussion that South Africa has to have. But the way in which political parties often use that discussion is for their benefit rather than the benefit of opening the discussion in the country in general. But I just want to know from you guys how you feel, whether you feel that will be an honest discussion or whether the ANC will be able to manipulate race once again, or will be able to manipulate race in the way that is so easy in South Africa. Thanks.
Thanks, Audrey. Well, let's take those two questions together, mainly because they fit quite nicely, Zulu and race, and race in general. James, do you want to start off with that?
Yep. I think they do all sort of tie together. I think a lot of people are worried about emerging tribalism. So certainly with you know, I mean, you mentioned the sort of the Zulu factor. I think that's real. But again, I think it comes back to sort of factionalism. You know, whether it's tribal, whether it's racial. It's again, Zuma addressed the fact that Afrikaans whites were more patriotic than English whites. So we're kind of going backwards, I feel, in terms of forging this common sort of national identity, which Mandela started. I think one has to be careful. Yes, we have to discuss these things. We can't just sweep them under the carpet. But I think there's ample precedence in Africa and worldwide of, you know, just what a tinderbox this is. And so I think I'm more in favour of having a sort of assertive kind of single national identity that we all subscribe to be South African, to be proud, to do away with these identity issues. I think your point about corporates, I think is a very good point. And again, you know, you can argue that they're a faction in their own right. I think that one of the encouraging things in the ASGISA initiative, which was the Accelerated and Shared Growth Initiative, which was a sort of Mbeki-era set of economic reform policies, was looking at competition policy. I think South African corporates are terrible. I mean, you know, there's ample evidence of you know, market abuse, you know, monopolies, cartels, and I think they have been in the pocket of government. They've moved very tactically to align themselves when necessary. I mean, we've gone from, you know, everyone was on, how should they side? How should they respond to Zuma? And you know, as soon as charges were removed, everybody, oh, Zuma, great guy, you know, we're with him. So I think, yes, I think that I think corporate. So it goes back to this broader theme of corruption. It goes back to this this you know, whether it's manifest and obvious corruption or whether it's sort of far more sort of below the surface. It's there. It's prevalent everywhere. I think the one positive, and I'll finish in this, is that the emergence or the rise of the left-wing elements within the National Executive Committee of the ANC, the sort of key decision-making body, I think there's two ways you can look at this. One is cynically their chance to feed at the trough, or indeed you can argue that you've now got a counterbalance to this heavily sort of concentrated crony elite who was able to sort of use the levers of state and benefit from it themselves. They can now, there's a counterbalance to sort of say, actually, hang on, my constituents haven't benefited from this. We need to drive the benefits further down. And again, I think that might well prove positive.
Great. Josephine, what do you...
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Come back to that.
I'm not so sure whether the ethnicity is going to play out as a very big issue in South Africa. I don't feel. I mean, when we went to KwaZulu-Natal and we spoke to Buthelezi, I mean, he didn't see Buthelezi being the leader of the Inkatha Freedom Party and, of course, an out-and-out Zulu. And so, as it happens, is the Zuma is also a Zulu. And they are both from the same, province. And Zuma managed to beat Buthelezi hands down in the April 22nd elections. And the majority of the people who voted there were Zulus. And so I don't see it. It's a matter of, I think, the policies and how you probably go out and get the votes. To me, that is that appears to be more important than the ethnic group from which the leaders come from, I feel. In terms of the race, well, I mean, the racial divide in South Africa is there, and it's going to be there for a very long time, not until perhaps the economic divide is bridged, or the gap is bridged. If that is bridged, maybe the racial issue will begin to become a non-issue. But until then, it's there because, I mean, people voted on racial lines. That is very, very true, apart from the fact that the ANC is the Liberation Party and it has a very big following, a big loyalty. But then again, it also had to do with, with race. I mean, that is how it is. For the time being, I mean, Ellen Ziller herself recognized that, and that is why some of her posters, she had one of these former ANC leaders who left the ANC, and I think went to the DA, and you'll see his posters, the two of them on their party posters, trying to show the rest of South Africa that, oh, we're not a white party. Well, I mean, the DA is seen by the majority of South Africans as the white party for the white English-speaking business, whilst I understand COPE is the party for the black middle-class business. Maybe those who are...
From Becky.
Yeah, but the racial divide is deep in political life, and politicians will use it if it will give them votes. I mean, it's obtains.
Two very brief points. One on race, a very good point, I think. One, I mean, I remember I was based in South Africa in Mandela's term in office, and I remember towards the end of his term in office, there was definitely this sense, particularly among black South African friends, that the old man had done a tremendous job on reconciliation, but wasn't it time that the country was a bit more open about race? And I went to see Thabo Mbeki, and he talked incredibly eloquently about all this, and I thought, this man is just the man to take the country forward, and he will just be a little bit more confrontational, but not, but he just gets it. Well, I was partly right, but partly wrong, because Mbeki's presidency has not been a terrific success. Right in as much as it was definitely time for South Africa to go beyond the sort of cozy kumbaya feeling about, we're all one happy nation and we'll all live happily ever after, to appreciating that there were huge racial problems still in South Africa. But Mbeki took it too far, and in as much as he used race very, very cleverly, as you know, for whenever he was, when he was criticised and policies were criticised, and I suppose even if you put that to one side, where it really mattered was, frankly, that there were all these white professionals that were leading the country, and South Africa just can't afford to lose them, and it's just that there's that sort of pragmatic issue, which ultimately is why race and the racial approach of the president matters. And Zuma, I think, he'll just be more mellow and laid back and so on. But I'd like to go to the Zulu question, because I think it is very interesting. I mean, I agree with you. I don't think there's some sort of great tribal split or feud that's about to kind of transform the political agenda. But Jacob Zuma is a proud Zulu man, and he's played off that very brilliantly to return to the political stage. He used it in the last 2 or 3 years. And there are many people in Zululand, well, that's a sort of technical term in a sense, because that's the sort of heart of the large area that the Zulus live in. But there are many people beyond Zululand in the province called KwaZulu-Natal who do feel it is our turn now. It is our turn to be in government and so on. So that's a very interesting dynamic. But Zuma's popularity has just gone way beyond that now. Yeah. And I mean, I've been to rallies, hundreds of miles away from the outermost reaches that Shaka, the great Zulu Napoleon, ever reached in the 19th century. And they're saying, he's our Messiah, he's our savior. So he used the Zuluness very well, and there are some Zulus who think, yay, we've got our man in the, I was about to say the White House, in the Union in the Union buildings. But it's now the Zuma phenomenon is beyond that now. For large numbers, particularly of poor South Africans, he's the Mr. Delivery.
And I think just to add to that, it's very important to bear in mind that the big political conflict in post-democracy South Africa was amongst Zulus. Zulus who supported the ANC and Zulus who supported the Inkatha Freedom Party. I do think that external to South Africa, the issue of ethnicity is overplayed, but I agree with Alec that I think that Zuma has used it very effectively to meet his political ends. But, if one wanted to play the number game, the vast majority of so-called Xhosas in South Africa, although they might not identify or define themselves as that in the first instance, voted for the ANC under Jacob Zuma. So I think ethnicity is overplayed. I think just on race, just to say that I think that the ANC is, and always has been, schizophrenic on race. On one hand, there is a deep history of non-racism in the ANC that I experienced personally. The only form of racism I experienced in a significant time in the ANC came from a white cabinet minister during all the arms deal stuff who suggested that I wouldn't have taken up the issue if the head of procurement in the Defense Force, the brother of Zuma's financial advisor, hadn't been Asian. So I very privately, he said this to a newspaper, very privately had to go and tell him that in fact my wife is Bangladeshi. That's the only time I experienced sort of overt racism in the ANC. But when it suits it, as Audrey said, for political ends, both internal political ends and external political ends, it does play the race card in quite subtle and devious ways. This final point I want to make on race is that we must bear in mind, and I say this as a white South African who experienced enormous benefits from apartheid, that white South Africa has had it incredibly good post the advent of democracy in South Africa. That the actual sacrifices in lifestyle that white South Africans have had to make have been virtually zero. Perhaps the only thing that one could talk about is that crime has spilt out from predominantly township areas where it was always extremely high into all areas of the country and has therefore affected white people most directly. And I think that is important to bear in mind. And then I just want to reiterate the importance of the point that Audrey made about the corrupting influence of big business, both in South Africa on the political process and external to South Africa. Companies like BAE and many other large corporations around the world have had a hugely corrupting influence, as I believe they do in the global political process.
And they still will do now, actually. With Zuma. They'll be perfectly happy to dance with it.
And that's probably why I'm doing my next book on the global arms business.
Stop selling your book.
And the impact it has on democracy. But that's
for the next one. Okay, we'll take some more questions from the floor. There's one at the back there, yeah?
Good evening. My name is Richard Cockett, a Zimbabwean activist. A very quick question. When you mention black empowerment, does black mean black or does black mean non-white?
I think that's quite easy to answer. At the back there?
Hi, my name's James Steele. I'm a writer. I'm just interested, perhaps just think more broadly about Africa and why often Africa has not done as well as it could have done over the last 50 years. Do you think is the problem a failure of African leadership, and does that problem stem mainly from tribalism? Is that the big problem in Africa?
Okay, any more? We'll take another one while we're here. There's one in the front here. Thanks.
Hi, good evening. My name is Linford Andrews. I work for the Commonwealth Secretariat. I just have two quick questions. Just maybe gauging the views of the panel on how you see under Zuma presidency the independence of the three branches of government, given the outcome of the Zuma corruption trial. And secondly, given Zuma's relationship with the trade unions, I'm interested in specifically finding out your views on how you see South Africa's relationship with Zimbabwe progressing over the next couple of months in particular. Thanks.
Thanks. Take one more while we're... There's one on there.
Thanks. Hannah Bullock, I'm a journalist. I just wondered, given that Zuma wasn't actually acquitted of his corruption and... Given that Zuma wasn't actually acquitted of his corruption and fraud and racketeering charges, but rather the case was sort of archived, do you think it's going to continue to affect his standing in the international arena?
Great. Well, there's several questions there. Shall I put one to each panelist? Who wants to say, interesting one about Zimbabwe. We've got a lot of speculation. New president of South Africa, how will affect Zimbabwe and the future of the new unity government in Zimbabwe? Who wants to tackle that one? Josephine.
I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier on. I don't think there will be any big change or any difference from what is happening now. It will always be the quiet diplomacy. We're not going to be shouting from the rooftops our dealings with Zimbabwe. It will always be South Africa will always talk to Zimbabwe if they have to behind closed doors. But for the world, they will put up a face that says, no, Zimbabweans must deal with it themselves. And that SADC, that's the Southern Africa Development Regional Body, to which Zimbabwe and, of course, South Africa belongs. And it's the body that has given former President Mbeki the authority to negotiate the peace in Zimbabwe. It will continue like that. I'm afraid there will not be any browbeating in public.
Anyone on the panel think Zuma will make a significant difference on Zimbabwe?
He was far more outspoken on the issue before Polokwane, before he was elected ANC president, to differentiate himself from Mbeki. And as soon as he was elected, he moderated his views, and it stayed fairly similar.
Yeah. He briefly, when he came to London, to coming out on the world stage to see Gordon Brown, that was the sort of height of his interventionist Zimbabwe rhetoric, and it was a wonderful routine because it made everyone think, God, this guy's going to be terrific and different and so on. But then he very rapidly, as pointed out, just made little difference effectively. I mean, as I said earlier, he talks a good game, but Zimbabwe, sadly for Zimbabwe, it's all going to come from within. It's not going to come from South Africa.
I'm surprised that, just to add quickly, I'm surprised that the trade unions in South Africa are not making a lot more noise over Zimbabwe. They do it in Swaziland. Maybe it's because Swaziland is a small country.
Run by a despot.
But yeah, they go and they support the struggle for democracy in Swaziland. But them being close associates of Zuma, you would have thought that maybe they will be making a lot of noise supporting the democratic process in Zimbabwe, but they haven't made a lot of noise. That has disappointed me, I have to say.
Audrey, you just wanted to chip in?
I think the point that the real question you were asking, Linford, was, given the trade union movement in South Africa's position on Zimbabwe, they are very opposed to Thabo Mbeki's quiet diplomacy and so on. The trade union movement, in fact, Zwelinzima Vavi, who's one of the main, and Gwede Mantashe, the ANC Secretary General, formerly from the trade union movement, they were actually removed from Zimbabwe unceremoniously for trying to stage a sort of march in support of. I think what's interesting about the question being asked is, what is Jacob Zuma going to do about those sentiments, because they still exist within the trade union movement.
Absolutely.
So
and how does he manage them?
What is he going to do about that? Plus, South Africa has issues with hundreds of thousands of Zimbabweans within the country that they have to deal with in some way or the other. But what interestingly, James, you were at this meeting last week when Matthew Sposa, the Treasurer General of the ANC, actually in the strongest terms I've heard, said that the ANC does not support Robert Mugabe's policy on land redistribution in Zimbabwe. And I thought I haven't heard such a strong statement about it. And I was just wondering whether there wasn't going to be a little bit more more public like using some voices in the public sphere associated with the ANC in order to make the point, or either for diplomatic reasons or actually to put pressure on the Zimbabwean government, because Jacob Zuma is a great strategist, actually, and I think that he may very well want to sort out the problem in a slightly different way to how Thabo Mbeki did. But for the moment, like Josephine said, Thabo Mbeki is in charge of South Africa's relationship with Zimbabwe.
Thanks, Audrey. Very briefly, do you want to deal with the one about the institutions and how they'll fare under...
And a quick comment on the acquittal issue.
Yeah, okay.
Just very quickly on the three branches, I think that pretty much since early 2001, the legislative branch of government has become a rubber stamp for the ANC. And there was a brief period in the lead up to Polokwane where it seemed to be asserting itself again, but that was because of the divisions within the ANC. Very quickly after Polokwane, for instance, one of the things that they did was they passed a resolution just after electing Jacob Zuma to disband the Scorpions, the anti-corruption unit, and that was rammed through Parliament, and Parliament played its usual rubber stamp role. So there's not a great deal of evidence that the legislature is going to reassert itself. In terms of the judiciary, I think that's really where the concerns lie, because Zuma himself and a number of his supporters have made a range of statements branding the Constitutional Court counter-revolutionary. Zuma, about 2.5 weeks ago, said that the status of the court might need to be reviewed and the justices mustn't see themselves as guards, which is just not a sensible thing to say given his own legal history in recent times. It just doesn't make sense for someone who's about to be the president to say those sort of things. So I do have concerns. I also think, let's be realistic. He hasn't been acquitted. The questioner was absolutely correct. They simply dropped the charges on a technicality. And the prosecutorial authorities have been destroyed in South Africa. And it would be an incredibly brave prosecutor who would bring charges against a senior politician on an issue of corruption in South Africa going forward. So those are... Just to make a quick comment on the acquittal. I mean, I really think if I had to try and capture what I think South Africa is going to be like, and how perhaps Zuma will be perceived in international circles, I do think that South Africa is in some ways has been in the process of becoming and is going to continue to become almost the Italy of Africa, in that its politics, I think, are going to be quite troubled. I think there is going to be
Zuma's going to get another divorce.
A lot of corruption. Hopefully he won't get a hair transplant. And I think that some people internationally will be a little bit embarrassed, because there is a High Court action in South Africa calling for a review of the acting prosecutor's decision to drop the charges on the technicality. And if that fails, they're going to be private prosecutions. And I think, James said earlier that he's very comfortable in his skin, which he really is. And it is quite a thick skin, just like Berlusconi's. And I think that international diplomacy is such that, they'll all get on okay. And Tony Blair went on holiday regularly with Mr. Berlusconi.
Okay, thanks, Tony. We've just got time for a quick more round of questions, and I'll put them to Alec and James. Sorry, we'll just answer the question, which is you can do it very quickly.
Very, very quick. Well, in essence, it's anyone who's not white, but there are all sorts of complications because, for example, women. Thank you. Women are also eligible for not for black economic empowerment contracts, but affirmative action also includes women. So a number of the beneficiaries of some of the big business deals have been white women, and that's caused a huge fury. So it's slightly more complicated.
Okay.
Asians as well, I think.
Asians. Previously disadvantaged, I think is the phrase. Yes, in
that's
the second row here.
Yeah.
Previously disadvantaged is how we define it technically.
My name is Carol Allen Story, and I'm a photojournalist, and I just recently got back from South Africa. I just have one broad question for the panel. Do you think Zuma is going to be an effective leader of South Africa and respected on the global stage? Simple as that.
And any other one on the aisle there, the gentleman there in the blue shirt?
Thanks, Malcolm Alexander. Can the panel say something about the position of Winnie Mandela at the moment? Is she still a significant force? And does Zuma depend upon her for the popular support?
Okay, one other? Somebody just behind him, the woman on the aisle.
I'm a journalist with The Guardian, and I wrote, or rather did a film about Dr. Rath, who Andrew might be aware of.
Oh, brilliant.
Known very well.
Who was responsible maybe for introducing quack remedies, saying that his vitamins treat AIDS, basically. I wondered, given the fact that AIDS campaigners have asked for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what the panel think on that.
Okay, I think we'll have to stop it there, just wrap up. Who wants to come back on? What has happened to Winnie Mandela? Do you know?
Well, as Andrew said, she might be in the cabinet.
She might be in the cabinet, really. She's
Right.
risen like the proverbial phoenix.
Right, God. Okay, there you are. The AIDS one, do you think the last question?
What, will there be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
Yes, well, maybe should there be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
Do you want to speak about that? I feel in a funny sort of way. Yes. What has happened in South Africa in the last 15, particularly last 10 years over AIDS, has been an absolute tragedy, and it's also been a political scandal. But I feel rather purist about truth and reconciliation, and I feel that once you start having too many truth and reconciliation commissions, it rather kind of debases the currency. And I think South Africa had this unique need. Or not quite unique, but it had a very special need for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which by the standards of similar bodies did an okay job. And so start having lots of other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions like this. People started asking about Zuma. Well, why not have a kind of blanket amnesty and forgive and forget I know that's not quite your point about HIV/AIDS. I mean, yes, it would be great to see Manto Tshabalala Msimang, the previous health minister who was implemented many of these sort of appalling policies, and arguably Thabo Mbeki being called upon to account for their decisions and their lack of leadership, and et cetera, et cetera. I suspect it won't happen, though. But
isn't the way forward to provide them, the sufferers, these nearly 6 million sufferers, with the drugs? Because really, I think perhaps that's the way forward. Because having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not going to make the HIV sufferers any better. It's better to give them the medication and the better healthcare system. For me, it's better you spend money on that than money on a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Can we end by just combining the two questions, one at the back about the future of South Africa and how Mr. Zuma will go on the world stage, how he will be regarded, and if each panelist could do a quick 1 minute wrap up, combining those thoughts. I mean, how good do you think Zuma will be for South Africa and Africa in general? Do you think anything about?
Yeah, I mean, the specific question about why Africa has struggled deserves its own kind of evening, and it's
which we can't
go into now. I think the point about the hopeful outlook for Zuma presidency is that he utilizes clearly his abundant talent at bringing different parties together, mediating, talking. I think that his role is very political rather than technocratic. I think we've tend to focus on the technical difficulties of delivery to the furthest flung rural areas, and yes, that's a huge challenge. But I think the far more immediate challenge is to bring essentially warring factions, within government and the ANC's NEC, who have very sort of polarized views on what policy should be, and to sort of forge a consensus which is both unifying and consistent, that allows effective policy to be implemented. And I think potentially Zuma can be good at that, but I think the danger, as was alluded to earlier, is that it's all just too much for him, that he's already committed to only one term, and it all just becomes, there's just too many ambitious people fighting for their corner, and he becomes ineffective from early on. But again, I think potentially he's the right person for what's needed at this time.
Josephine, your concluding thought.
Thank you. Well, Zuma, as has been said, was the head of the ANC intelligence wing when, they were fighting against the apartheid government. So we would expect him to therefore be able to sense when there were difficulties within his inner circle, and can, deal with that quite easily. But then again, as you said, he is a good listener. He listens to people a lot, probably is because he's not as educated as Thabo Mbeki, so he wants to listen to what people say. And as they also tell me that he is a reconciliator. He brings people together. So hopefully we will see him in a situation whereby he is able to draw all the talent together, listen to the good points in order to be able to take South Africa forward. Because Africa needs South Africa to be powerful in Africa, to not be as corrupt as the rest of Africa. And perhaps to answer a little bit about your point about leadership in Africa, well, it will take the whole day, but I don't think the problems in Africa is tribal. It is nothing to do with tribes. I mean, how many tribal wars are there in Africa? I don't think it is to do with tribalism. I think maybe it is to do with greed. And we should also not forget that there are external influences which, unfortunately, the African leaders are not able to ignore. I mean, let's face it, big business have a very corrupting influence on what happens in Africa. You have former colonial powers as well who would not take the right decision. They will take a decision that is good for Britain or that is good for America, etc., etc. So all of those influences go to make Africa what it is today, but it is the fault of us as Africans maybe not standing up and be counted. We should not exclude ourselves as the masses in all of this.
Thank you, Josephine. Alec, you're concluding.
One line on history and leadership. There has been appalling leadership, but it's, as Josephine said, it's not fair just to say leadership. History, the weight of history, which again is the subject of another lecture, and the role of other countries from outside Africa are also hugely important. But sort of in a sense more interesting, Jay-Z. As was famously said of Bush, or as he said of himself, I guess, he kept saying he was famously misunderestimated. I think one can misunderestimate Jacob Zuma, and there's a good side to that and a bad side to that. One, beyond this sort of cuddly persona, there's a very, very tough, ruthless politician, and he's very capable, he can get things done, but he's also a hard man, and he's made some tough decisions in the past, and ruthless decisions in the past, and he may well do so again. So one shouldn't be fooled into thinking that he's just some sort of, hail fellow, well-met figure who's just going to have a sort of benign smile and so on, and let other people get on with things. But equally, he is a very, very skillful politician, and I genuinely think there is something in him that wants to prove everyone wrong. And he feels this is his chance. Now there are all sorts of exceptionally malign influences around him, and he clearly has all sorts of weaknesses himself. So whether he's able actually to do that is obviously a completely different question. But I think there is something within him that sees this as a chance to kind of set the record straight. He can't set the record straight on the corruption and so on, but that maybe people will say, well, he's a bit of a rogue, but hey, these 5 years have been better than Mbeki's, and that's, I think, what we have to hope for.
Andrew, concluding thought.
I think that South Africa will continue to do okay, better than the vast majority of countries in Africa, but not nearly as well as it could do. I think that we have had over 80 years of a very bad president, and I think we have continued to do okay in that context. I think that overall, Jacob Zuma will not be an effective leader. And the reason I feel that is because I believe that the strength of the rule of law in South Africa, the Bill of Rights and the South African Constitution, and the much-needed economic emancipation of the poor are all inextricably bound. And I think the first two of those, Jacob Zuma is not going to be a great defender of and might even undermine further.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much to all our panelists for a fantastic discussion. There you have a whole range of views from Zuma shining success to practically a disaster. We'll find out. And now you can mob Andrew and Alec at least at the table where they flog their books, and
discount,
and there's a bar downstairs. So thank you very much.